My name is Dr. Jasmol Sardana, and I'm a plant-based primary care internist and a board-certified lifestyle medicine physician, as well as a mommy to 3 plant-based kids. Thank you for joining us for the next conversation in our series, Planted. This series was created specifically to support families who are starting on or continuing on or even returning to their plant-based journey. Susan Levin is Director of Nutrition Education for the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine. As Director of Nutrition Education for the Physicians Committee, Ms. Levin conducts clinical research studies and publishes dietary reviews about the connection between diet and health. Ms. Levin also counsels patients in a clinical setting at the nonprofit Barnard Medical Center and creates comprehensive nutrition plans for individuals and communities. Ms. Levin is also co-author of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics position paper on vegan and vegetarian diets. Last but not least, Susan is a plant-based mom to the sweetest little boy around. Thank you, Susan, for being with us here today. Before we get started, I was wondering if you could tell us just a little bit about your family's personal plant-based journey.
Yeah, okay. So I have been, I was vegetarian in college, right? It's what you're supposed to do in college. And then I just became a little bit more informed, or information was thrust upon me about not a little bit beyond just not consuming meat, but also eggs and dairy. So I came from it from an ethical angle, honestly. I was not into science. I was not even close to becoming a dietitian. And once though I transitioned into a vegan diet, so this is more than 25 years ago now, I just had all these amazing revelations about my body and oh my gosh, suddenly maintaining a healthy weight was not a struggle anymore. Having good skin just happened, no more breakouts. I mean, it was all kind of a little bit superficial. I don't really have one of those really great awe-inspiring stories, but I just realized
I think that's important because, as I think that's the experience for a lot of us, is that once you start this way of eating, you don't really necessarily expect maybe some of these benefits. You realize, I do enjoy having clear skin.
And I
do enjoy going to the restroom regularly.
Right. How do you put that down on paper? But
right.
Yes, and I grew up in Alabama. I grew up in the deep South on, if not a Southern diet, which ain't that healthy. It was a kind of a latchkey kid diet. It was very highly processed. A lot of mac and cheese, a lot of fish sticks, tater tots, just stuff that wasn't very helpful. So I had no awareness of what a healthy diet looked like, nor did my mother. So, no criticism. But but for that reason, our whole family kind of struggled with weight. The older generation was always on a diet, right? There wasn't a person who wasn't on a diet at all times. Weight Watchers, whatever. So I just kind of thought that's how life was. You just sort of struggle and you limp along, kind of doing a diet and kind of not. But once I gave up the dairy products on top of my already vegetarian diet and the eggs, I just effortless, right? Suddenly I'm the right weight. Suddenly I can run. I had been a limping runner, meaning I just couldn't figure out the respiratory factors of running until, right. So anyway, all that kind of fell into place. I didn't really talk about it because health wasn't my goal. It just sort of happened. And I happened to work at that time, on a boat, so in Key West. So I was always in a bathing suit, and I think somebody, just you've lost a lot of weight, not a lot, but you've lost weight,
right? Noticeable,
right? And it was I guess I have. I kind of felt like I lost that dairy layer. That's what I call it.
That's a good way to put it. Absolutely.
Yeah, and then I just got kind of obsessed with what happened. What is it that I just gave up that has contributed to all these benefits? And I just started reading, and I haven't stopped. And it led into, a different career. I was a journalism major, which is why I worked on a boat. And I became I went back to school for all the science that I avoided, the biology, the chemistry, the physics. Took me 3 years to get through all that, plus 2 years graduate school, a year internship to become a dietitian. Like, I was really into this. So the health aspects of this diet change are really what have guided my life for the past 20 years to the second career. And then eventually in my 40s, actually, because I think my career came so late, I got pregnant. And no, it wasn't hard to get pregnant even though I'm vegan, like people, even though it's old and vegan, right? Well, that's going to be hard. You should start trying now because it's going to take you 10 years. No, I got pregnant. I'm not saying everybody's going to get pregnant who's vegan. I'm just saying that it's certainly not it's not birth control. So I had my son at 43. I'm almost 50 now. So he's 6. It's a lot of information, personal information. And he was vegan through conception, through 9 months in my stomach, and he's been vegan his whole life. At his whole life, he's 6. But yeah, and my husband's vegan, so we're pretty good at this. And it's been a lot easier than I would have thought with a child, right? Like I mean, he's been at it since birth, so there's really no. If anything, it's an interesting experiment in indoctrinating your children to do whatever you want. It's pretty easy, and I can kind of see why where that can go wrong. But in this case, it's gone really right. Like he loves being vegan. He loves talking about the environmental aspects.
Oh my gosh.
For the animals. Like, he's running around this area. You know how we have cicadas everywhere now?
Yes. Oh gosh. Yes.
Picking all the cicadas off the sidewalk and putting them somewhere safe. And it's like, it's going to take forever to get where we're going. But yay, he's very compassionate.
He's compassionate.
But yes, someday I hope it's more about, no, I don't care. But someday I hope he realizes all the health benefits to him as well.
Thank you, Susan. I mean, that's so special to be able to gain some insight into a professional, someone like you who is so incredibly knowledgeable in this area, to gain some insight into what your personal path has been like. And I think that's a wonderful way to kind of connect with our audience who might be in similar boats or can, relate to one or more aspects of the things that you mentioned there. So thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate it.
Of course.
And I know that we're going to go into a little bit more of the nitty gritty, the micronutrients of this diet, which I think is really important to do, because I think when I do speak with families, individuals in my own personal clinic, I speak to them in our clinic, that some of the concerns that they have is, well, I'm not really sure that this is right. I'm not, they don't really feel confident in eating this way. And I really want to have this conversation with you to allay all those fears. I want, our audience to understand that you are not only going to survive on a plant-based diet, you are going to thrive on a plant-based diet. And you're going to thrive in ways that you never really expected, just like you mentioned. And such a wonderful kind of experience for ourselves, for our families, personally speaking as well. So thank you again for being with us. And so before we get into kind of like the details of the nutrients to be aware of on a whole food plant-based diet, I just want to step back, and we've talked to Dr. Huff about this too, but just a simple question to you as well. You mentioned dieting earlier, right? That's something that all of our audience definitely can connect with and resonate with. There's so many types of competing diets out there, and it's kind of daunting to think about what exactly is the best for me. So tell us, Susan, what exactly is a healthy diet?
Yeah, so the good news is that this isn't just my opinion. There's so much good documented evidence to say that a diet that is centered on grains, fruits, vegetables, and beans is the best diet. Absolutely. And you can look into the dietary guidelines, with which I have a lot of problems. It is a very conservative, industry-backed document, but even it will tell you, like, all healthful dietary patterns are based on plants. Go into any other organization, American Heart, American Cancer, Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, they're all going to tell you that this is at the core, the healthiest way to eat is a plant-based diet. So we have so much research and reputable organizations to back up that statement, which makes me feel good, but it also makes me feel good in talking to patients, like you mentioned.
Exactly. I think that's 100% important to lay out first off, is that this is not an opinion. This is not just because I happen to enjoy eating this way and you happen to enjoy eating this way. This is really backed by scientific evidence. And the important large organizations that you mentioned support this way of eating. And it's really us bringing this information to you in this new platform in an easy, digestible way. And to really tell our families that you can eat this way. It's enjoyable, it's possible, and it's the healthiest way to eat. And when I have had discussions with family members, they're certainly worried because maybe they maybe not all have started off their families by being vegan or plant-based. And so this is a new way of eating for them as well as their children. And they're, understandably a little bit hesitant and a little bit worried about, could I really do this? Is this really going to be, maybe this is going to be too difficult, or maybe this might be too burdensome. What advice would you have for parents who are worried about that?
Well, I don't think that, yes, look, like I mentioned, where I grew up, it's not that the diet itself is burdensome or challenging or overcomplicated, where you have to run around with, a slide rule or a calculator. It pretty much at its core is very simple. But that doesn't mean it fits well into the American or Western culture very well, right? We just weren't raised this way. I was raised to struggle with diet. And I was raised with this concept of restriction, and so the vegan diet in and of itself is not more of a burden than any other diet in terms of just trying to figure out what works for you and what's healthy. I mean, if anything, when you're talking about a vegan diet, you're starting with that core, the fruits, the vegetables, the beans, and the grains. And if you're not, if you're starting from a meat eating dietary pattern, that to me is like, well, burden's on you to figure out where you're going to get all these important nutrients that you get from that agreed upon core healthy diet, right? Well, how are you going to get fruits and vegetables and beans and grains into your family's pattern if where you're starting off is this concept of animal being at the center of the plate, right? So that to me, that's the burden. We're kind of starting off ahead of the game in a way. But I don't think you have to kind of go through adopting or a vegan diet or being on a vegan diet and thinking in terms of nutrients even. Like it's, what is, the reductionism conversation. Now, today, that is what I'm here to do. And I do think it's important to just kind of put it out there so people can hear it. But in general, it's not like you walk through life thinking about, or as a dietitian, I'm telling you, and I tell my patients this all the time, you don't have to walk around thinking about every little thing you put in your mouth. If you're eating a variety of plants, you're going to be great. It kind of takes care of itself. And there's peace of mind in that. It's so simple. Again, not to underestimate or downplay the cultural challenges with this, or even the mental challenges. If you were raised a certain way, again, like I was, very far from this type of eating. But the diet itself just kind of takes care of everything. If again, not trying to oversimplify or downplay the importance of our conversation today. Sure. But in general, and sometimes I'll even say, when animals are walking around, other animals, non-human animals are walking around the planet eating, they're not thinking about, am I getting enough vitamin C? Like they're just eating what is natural to them, hopefully. Right. I mean, we've put a lot of animals in a bad situation where they're not eating what's natural to them. But if all is well, they eat what they're supposed to eat and it takes care of itself. And I think that's true of humans too. Like we eat what we're supposed to eat and the other stuff kind of falls into place.
Thank you for that perspective, because I think we do, overcomplicate this process a little bit because it is because it might be so different from how you were raised. So it feels like, well, I have to like relearn or understand all of the science and the nutrients behind all of this before I can actually feel confident enough to choose this way of eating. But what you're telling us and what we're hearing is that if you're, sticking to the legumes, the plant proteins, fruits and vegetables, and you're focusing on that first and foremost, all those other things kind of work themselves out. And you're so right. There is that peace of mind once you get that. It took me a minute to figure that out because I wasn't sure initially. But then you realize, it's not that hard. And when I am eating this way, my kids are growing, I'm healthier, I'm feeling even, I feel better. So I know things are working out. And it is an oversimplification. It's actually just a fact. It's not as hard as it has to be. But today's discussion, I think, will only add to that in that, it is simple, but let's, make sure that you do know what these important parts are of a whole food plant-based diet.
And I want to just add, or maybe even reiterate, that the way I grew up, like eating was eating well was such a struggle, and it was complicated. Like my family was always thinking about calories and points or whatever, whatever the program was, that you might even just be raised to believe eating is just hard. It's just hard. Being healthy is hard, and it's ingrained in us because that's what we saw for so long. But once you get on this track and you do that legwork like you did and I did, I became a dietitian. I did so much of it. But once you get there, it's like, it's really not, like, eating is fun and it's good and it tastes good and it works for you. It doesn't work against you when you have the right pattern in place.
I love that. We hear a lot these days about all these different types of diets that are out there, the paleo, keto diets that are out there. And, depending on what diet you're talking about, there's a particular macronutrient that's predominant in that particular type of diet. So a keto diet is focused on fat. The paleo diet might be focused on proteins. A plant-based diet is certainly carbohydrate rich in comparison to those diets. And generally speaking, though, how do we, as parents, how do we think about carbs, fats, the protein needs of our family?
Yeah. So again, when you're eating fruits, vegetables, beans, and grains, in a variety, you're getting enough calories. So at the end of the day, honestly, when you are as lucky as we are in terms of access to food, if you're lucky enough to have access to a variety of food, especially beans, grains, fruits, and vegetables, and I don't mean handpicked from your local farmer. I mean in a can, dried in a bag, frozen, however you can get it. If you have access to that, then you don't have to be such a reductionist about the carbs, protein, and fat, because every plant comes in this perfect proportion of what these are. What we're talking about right now is macronutrients, like the big nutrients, the stuff you measure in grams. That stuff is packaged perfectly, whether you're talking about an oat or an apple or a black bean, or broccoli. Like, they're all going to be a little bit different. Like a potato, maybe 0 to 1% fat and a lot more complex carbs, whereas broccoli is 9% fat and 33% protein. So they vary in these macronutrients, but at the end of the day, if you've had a variety, you're getting them all in a perfect proportion. And I will say that also when you eat like that, it's a high carb diet. It is a lot of fiber, a lot of complex carbohydrates. That's what is in the plant. But again, it does have that fat. It's not a fat-free diet. Like I said, broccoli is 9% fat. Grains and beans might have a little bit more. Fruits have less. But at the end of the day, those macronutrient proportions are perfect. And that's kind of takes away some of this calculations that you need to do. We can do it. Like, everybody's protein needs can be calculated based on their weight and age and all this. But I'm telling you, at the end of the day, when you eat a variety of plants, you will have met those needs.
And, it's so simple. But and no matter however many times I say it though, it feels like to me that some of my patients are just not convinced. They're like, oh, are you sure? I just have to. There's a poster, right? There's that rainbow poster that's in our exam rooms. And I point to that at every visit. If you are getting a rainbow of fruits and vegetables, consistently, all of your needs are going to be met.
Right.
I understand some of our, families out there are going to need a little bit more convincing. And we did mention, you mentioned carbs, and I think that's a good starting point. Maybe we can touch a little bit about carbs. And we have some, I don't know, it feels like there's kind of a couple different schools of thought when it comes to carbs. We have overwhelming evidence to tell us that certain types of carbs are linked to poor health. But at the same time, as you mentioned, right, a plant-based diet it's high in carbs. It's a carbohydrate-rich diet. And when you look at, and I've mentioned this before in our last conversation about the blue zones, the areas of the world where people who live the longest, their diet is a very high carbohydrate diet. So we have carbs that are not so great and carbs that are good. So it seems like we have some seemingly contradictory evidence here with regards to carbs. And I wonder, in other words, Susan, are all carbs kind of created equal? And if not, which one should we be choosing? Which one should we be limiting with our families?
Yeah. So I love this question because, full disclosure, I'm also a sports dietitian. So I love talking about carbs for a lot of reasons. So let me start with how carbohydrates are just hands down the preferred energy source for our body. And that's whether you're talking about your fuel to exercise or just your basic brain function. Your body wants to use your carbohydrate. Breaking down muscle, even breaking down fat is not the preferred source of energy or brain fuel. It might sound like a good idea. Like, of course, I want to break down the fat instead of the energy I store from carbohydrate because that just sounds good. It's like, well, it's not really the biological reason why we have fat. It's there for emergencies. Unfortunately, we're just constantly eating. We're never really in a not unfortunately. Let me say fortunately. We're never in a state of famine. Much us. I'm talking about like in a Western culture and presumably most people, or if not everybody on this call. So we are eating though like there's going to be a famine. So we're storing a lot of fat in our bodies that we're never going to use. So to me, the solution isn't figuring out how to burn it off in a way that our body would prefer not, but rather just having a diet that sustains a healthy amount of fat, a healthy amount of muscle, and good, glycogen, which is just your carbohydrate stores for energy that your body really wants to use and your brain will only use. So I kind of want to put that out there first, the importance of carbohydrate. But yes, is there a difference between carbohydrates? Of course, there are very refined carbohydrates. There's sugar, like white sugar is sort of the ultimate villain because it doesn't really bring anything to the table other than the fact that it is glucose and it has calories, but it's not going to bring any nutrients, micronutrients that you need, phytochemicals, all that's gone when you refine sugar cane down to just white sugar. So that's kind of the ultimate, and we can put that in anything, and we can make other things into sugar, like corn into fructose corn syrup. And, there's a lot of sugars. There's a lot of added sugars out there, and that is so different than the healthful carbohydrates that we're talking about from plants. And I always remind people, like patients, like, look, fiber is a carbohydrate. Are you going to tell me that Americans are over consuming fiber? Because I have some really good data that show we way under consume fiber, a carbohydrate, and probably in large part for this reason that we focus so much on being afraid of carbohydrates that people are scared of bananas. Like people think carrots are too sugary. Yeah. It's like, what do you say? Like, this is not the problem in America, bananas and carrots. Like those are healthy carbohydrates. We need to be consuming more of them. They're colorful, like you said, the rainbow, naturally colorful, very high in fiber. And fiber isn't like the Lone Ranger here. Fiber comes with all those healthful micronutrients, which we could talk about later, but comes with all those phytochemicals and antioxidants that protect us. And when we start to become carb phobic, we're avoiding protective components of food. We're avoiding things that protect us from heart disease, diabetes, and cancer.
Yes.
And just fight off all these bad things that we're exposed to in the environment with rich antioxidants in all these colorful foods. So I do try to emphasize to people, there is a huge difference. And just because, I get it. Again, like culturally, when you look at an American's diet, it is full of refined carbohydrates. So I get why people just take the low-hanging fruit and say, well, we shouldn't eat so many carbs. It's like, well, wait a minute. What are you talking about? Doritos and Twizzlers? Okay. But I need people to be eating more carbohydrate from a different source so that we can prevent these diseases, which we suffer greatly in younger and younger populations. That's what typically gets us, are these diet-related chronic diseases. And it is not from over-consuming fiber.
Yeah. One of my favorite parts of eating a whole food plant-based diet is the fact that it is naturally fiber rich. And I didn't understand, even as a physician going through medical school, this wasn't something that I learned while I was in medical school, how incredibly important fiber is, and those healthy carbs that you mentioned. We maybe had a blurb about how, fiber might be helpful with regards to heart disease, but that was really it. Not really any detail into how to incorporate that into a diet or how to encourage our patients to get more of that fiber. It's really just, that one stated fact. So I agree. I think having this conversation where we're teasing out the differences, that not all carbs are created equal, that we do have to really be considerate and mindful of the type of carbs, the sources of carbohydrates that we're eating from. And it's actually beneficial, important, vital, critical that we're getting healthy carbs and fiber, as it were, for all of these wonderful health benefits.
Exactly.
One other thing that comes to mind when I think about carbohydrates, you talked about kind of refined sugars, right? And one of the things that our family initially struggled with, and I know other families struggle with, or maybe are hesitant, one of the things they might be hesitant about in maybe starting to eat this way, is that our families' palates have kind of already become accustomed to a certain level of, Skittles and Twizzlers and chocolate and candy and treats, that are just there and around. And maybe we're not thinking about so much. So when we then start thinking about, well, I need to take all of these things out of my child's diet, and, you hear, well, replace it with an apple or a fruit. They're not going to buy that. There's no way, right? And so what tips do you have? What advice would you have for families who are kind of at that stage, or maybe at that space where they're like, well, my kids really enjoy a lot of these treats and I'm, worried about taking those away from them. How do we reset our palates in our homes?
Yeah.
Is it possible?
So quite literally, you can reset a child's palate just as you can in adults. And we see this with fat, we see this with salt. Once you scale back and add it back, it becomes much more intense and a little less fun. And it's the same with sugar. So you can scale back on the sweeteners that you give to your children. So that may mean just avoiding a lot of added sugars, and notably, and I would say probably, hopefully one of the easiest things is avoiding sugar sweetened beverages. So sodas, it's just, it's so not helpful. So if you can, avoid those or start to scale back, wean your children off. And that is one of those very high, sets the bar really high for a tolerance for sugar, right? Because it's a ton of sugar in those sodas. And I would say the same thing for like sweetened, sweet tea. Hopefully kids aren't drinking a lot of tea, but or sports drinks even. So just being really cautious with those. Additionally, super refined sweets at the grocery store. So packaged cookies, what are they made with? Chances are sugar and white flour are going to be the top two ingredients. Well, and fat, right? You get salt, sugar, and fat together, and that's just a recipe for addiction.
Right.
So you want to just start pulling away from those types of treats. And if that means going into your kitchen and occasionally with or without, but hopefully with your child, baking some of these things on your own, where you control the amount of sweetness and the type of sweetness, right?
Yes.
There's certainly sweeteners that are much preferred over high fructose corn syrup, and we just can control that better in our own kitchens. And for example, when I bake something sweet, I tend to use less, but I'll use something like a banana.
Mm-hmm.
I'll use that instead of eggs, but it brings in a lot more sweetness. But I don't have to use as much of the sugar, and I often use pure maple syrup.
Yes.
If you can do dates.
That's something we use at home.
Yep. Okay. So there's so many more options that you can experiment with. Applesauce brings in some sweetness to a baked good too. So you can either scale back on the sugar, use a different kind of sugar, or just overall less added sugar, because the fruit brings so much to it. I think we could also change our relationship with.
Yes. Talk to us about that.
Yeah. So we have a tendency, guilty of having celebrations with a lot of dessert, right?
Of course,
So maybe figuring out other ways to celebrate milestones without having something highly sweet at the center of it all. So, I get it. Once a year, birthday cake, whatever.
Sure.
But if we're doing that all the time at everybody's birthday, at everybody's special holiday, whether it's Mother's Day, Father's Day, if it's constantly about dessert, maybe you should find something else. And let me tell you a funny story. My son's virtual 6th birthday party, nobody was here except the 3 immediate family members. But he had a cake, and it had all these Minecraft figures on top, right? A friend made it. Thank you very much. And he was in love with this Minecraft cake. But my sister sent over an edible arrangement. And I was like, what the heck? Like, what kid wants an edible arrangement on his birthday or ever? It had a big balloon on it. It was very cute. But I couldn't believe it. He was into the cake visually, but he went crazy on this edible, pineapple and strawberries. And I was like, what? I mean, that thing got destroyed before. It was just fine. I was like, okay. My sister has more experience, clearly. With so it can happen. Like, we can celebrate with other things, and it's not even a disappointment. And then rewards are the same way. Like, hey, if you behave in this social situation, I will take you to get ice cream. Just behave. Like, make it something else. Like, there are other things that my child, and I'm sure other people's children, would so much appreciate. It takes a little more effort maybe, but I know I can get my kid to do almost anything if I take them to the playground that's far away that I don't really want to go to, but I'll do it if you behave. So there are other ways to reward children outside of just sweets. So we work together to kind of get them off of that addiction.
You make such a good point, Susan. I think when we think about our children, sometimes we put limits on them or what they will do based on how we would behave. And that example of your son choosing the edible arrangements over the cake is just that. We think, of course, he's going to want the cake. Of course, he's going to want, the sweet things, because that's what I would want. And that's what and that's not necessarily true. And so let's give our kids credit. Let's not put our own biases and limitations on them, and give them the opportunity to show up and show us, the things that they really enjoy. Those are really great tips for reducing and or kind of resetting the palate of your child or of an individual. And something that I think all of our viewers, our listeners, I'm sure there's one thing that you mentioned there that they could start doing. Definitely. So we kind of covered carbs, the good, the healthier types of carbs versus the refined carbs, the differences between that. The next big macronutrient that we can talk about, I think could be fats. As an internal medicine physician, I'm always talking about fats with my patients, excuse me. When I speak to my patients, we're talking about preventing, treating, reversing chronic disease. And my conversations at every visit is, talking to them about adopting a low-fat, whole food, plant-based diet. And there is incredible, wonderful, strong, solid evidence in support of eating that way in order to, manage your health concerns. So when it comes to families and when it comes to children, how important is it and how healthy is it for children to eat certain types of fats? What types of fats should they be eating? What types of fats should they be avoiding?
Mm-hmm. Yes. So just to reiterate, yes, fats are essential to our bodies, and nothing about what we prescribe to adults even, but especially children, is a no fat program. We need some fat. They help with cell membrane function and form, hormones, certain fat soluble nutrients need the fat in our bodies to absorb. So they're undoubtedly essential. And that's why we have what are called essential fatty acids. Mm-hmm. So there's really only two types of fat in this world of fats that we have access to that we need to consume. And there are omega-3 and omega-6. And we can kind of go into this a little bit later, but children are no different. Children need those two essential fatty acids, omega-3 and omega-6. But yeah, here's how I think about how much fat does a child need? And I always start because I'm such a huge advocate of breastfeeding when possible. Mm-hmm. I know that's not always possible. But I think about the makeup of breast milk and how it is absolutely the perfect food for a baby. And it is pretty fatty. So that informs me as a mother or a dietitian that a baby's diet needs good fats in it. So if it's coming from the breast milk, that's great. As you start to bring in solid foods into the baby's diet, it too should somewhat reflect that nutrient profile, I would say. So yeah, there are really good, healthy sources of fats for children once you start giving solid foods, and those can be the nuts, the seeds, the nut butters, the seed butters, more popular flax seeds, chia seeds, hemp seeds, and these are all seeds that are actually really high in that first essential fat I mentioned, omega-3. So that's good because we know it's one of the essential fats. Olives, I don't know, did I mention avocados? So I really like these whole food sources of fats. So I don't give a lot of leeway with, I don't like to see kids eating a lot of processed oils and things like that either. So I much prefer it come from the whole food and when possible. So as we get older, yeah, we can scale back on these fats. We don't need so much, and they might contribute to more chronic disease. And this is why we tend to tell our patients, and we do, like in this country, we just flat out overconsume fat. So yeah, we'll eventually have to kind of adjust those dietary choices as we get into adulthood. But for the most part for kids, I think those are excellent sources of fats, and they should be part of the overall diet profile. And there's other products too, beans tend to be a little bit higher in all those good fats. So soybeans, even tofu, tempeh, if you get your kids into those products, those are really good sources of not only fat, but also fiber, protein, and
all those other things.
Yeah,
absolutely. One of the, as a side, I never thought, so my kids were not raised, or they weren't born plant-based or vegan. They've been vegan now for some time, but they didn't start off that way. And I couldn't believe, or there's some days I'm still kind of surprised how they fight over a bowl of like stir-fried veggies and tofu. Like I couldn't, and I think that more families need to hear that it's possible, and that if you step into the role of the provider who's making those decisions versus being letting your child tell you what they want all the time, at least, that again, your child will show up, they will surprise you. So I had to share that little tidbit. I'm still incredibly surprised and happy about it.
Yeah. And I remember seeing a baby way before I ever had a kid eating edamame at a Japanese restaurant, like pulling the pea, a baby, like pulling the beans out of the pot. And I was like, what? I mean, that stuff, babies love edamame. So I was one of the, when my kid got teeth, I was like, it's all about the edamame. And it's edamame. They love there's certain things like you'd never think, but there's something there that kids really love.
Exactly. You mentioned the omega-3 fatty acids. Some, there's some questions surrounding omega-3 fatty acids because in a plant-based diet, if you're not consuming fish, we're often told that omega-3 fatty acids are predominantly, found in fish and fish products. So plant-based families may have some concern about getting this fatty acid. How do plant-based families ensure that they're getting an adequate amount of this, essential fatty acid? Where is it located? And is supplementation ever needed?
Okay. So going back to this being one of the 2 essential fats, omega-3, omega-6. And honestly, like we talked about, our plants are going to be packaged with everything we need in the right ratio. And that is true of fats. And that is true of the 2 essential fats. And it is way more important to think about the ratio of 3 to 6, because it's not like you need that much. You just we get way more than we need at the end of the day, but it's really about that ratio. So if you're way over consuming all the fats from oils, which are very rich in omega-6, you're going to kind of smother the omega-3. And it's all about, how do I simplify this? So omega-3 is great, but in and of itself, it's not enough. It has to be digested and elongated. What that means is its little molecules get elongated and they turn into something new, and they're called, and this is what you'll see on vitamin packs, EPA, DHA.
Yes.
That's really what omega-3s bring to the table, is their potential in your body to turn to EPA, DHA. Now, a fish does that. A fish eats his algae, and he converts that omega-3 in the algae to EPA, DHA. And that's why people are like, oh, just eat the fish. Like, he already did it. We can do it. We can do it too if our overall diet is very healthy and not bombarded by a lot of fat. So, and again, the ratio, especially in these whole foods that we've been talking about, the avocados and the nuts and the seeds, the ratio is going to be great for that, especially for kids. You can really target the sources with the flax, the chia, the hemp, and walnuts. And that's fine. That's fair enough. I think it's a nice security blanket. But in general, you don't even, as long as your diet is overall whole and plant-based, that ratio will take care of itself. That said, let me address the supplement question. I do recommend an EPA DHA supplement, algae derived, because I like to avoid any possible contaminants in the poor fish who has to swim in our contaminated waters, an EPA DHA supplement for nursing mothers, so that we can make sure that that's getting into the breast milk and into the baby's body and brain. And a formula will offer that as well. But that's the only time that I a little more like, let's just go ahead.
You should probably make sure that it's consistent. Got it. No, that makes absolute sense. Absolutely. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
So my next question, I'm sure you've never heard this one before.
Yes.
I don't know, Susan, is it possible to get enough protein from a whole food plant-based diet?
Why, yes, Dr. Sardana. And I so knew you were going to ask this that I brought prompts. I brought prompts from my cabinet.
Yes.
Because I'm like, this is ridiculous. But let me act like I'd never heard this before from somebody. Oh, yeah, you know what? It's more than possible. It's actually inevitable that if you're eating enough calories from a variety of plants, you will get enough protein.
Wow. You said inevitable.
Yeah.
I love it. I love it. Yes. Go on.
Now, I want to put numbers on it because I do think that
Okay.
people hear this 100 million times and they still don't get it. And I did, I can't tell you how many pediatricians or OBGYNs were just like, are you sure you get enough protein? Like the whole thing.
Right.
So I want to put some numbers on it. And I specifically looked at like, what are the needs of children? Now, while it's based on weight and other factors, they do put some numbers next to different age ranges, including adults. But for children, 1 to 8, and it ranges based on age. But I just kind of, for simplicity's sake, 15 grams of fiber a day for children around 1 to 8. 35 as they move up into that next range, 9 to 13.
Protein. Then, did you mean protein?
Oh, yes. Protein grams. What did I say? Fiber. Oh, I'm sorry. No. No. Yes. Grams of protein. So about 35 grams of protein in the 9 to 13 age range. And then it jumps up to about 50 during the teen years. And, and that's kind of about where it stays as an adult because we sort of stop growing. And, side note, people who eat a lot of protein because they're trying to diet, protein is what you need to grow. It's actually something that makes you. So I always thought that was like ironic. Like you're on a high protein diet. You know what protein does, right? It makes you. Anyway, so 15 grams, 35 grams. What does all that mean? And while it's in all plants, protein is in your fruits and your vegetables. It's in your beans and grains. Maybe more so in the beans and the grains, but still it's there. But just for context, I calculated the amount of protein in literally a tortilla with black beans, small tortilla. Okay. It has about 12 grams of protein. So when you were talking about you need 15 grams of protein.
Really?
Yeah. So, and then a cup of steamed broccoli has about 4 grams of protein. 3/4 a cup of pasta, maybe 6 to 7. An 8-ounce cup of soy milk, 12. Right. And a half a cup of cooked beans is going to have about 7. And so I just literally went to and these aren't foods. It's like, well, what's that? Where am I going to get? No. I have so much white pasta, guilty, in my cupboard. And I used to show this when I do grocery store tours back when we were allowed to see people. I would say, look at this white pasta. And you could do better, right? You could do whole.
Right.
It has 6 grams of protein for what this calls 2 ounces. But I'm going to go ahead and say it's half a cup, 3/4 of a cup. I mean, what's even in white pasta? It's just flour, yet it has that much protein. I pulled this out of my garbage because I had this for lunch. But 1/4 or 1/5 of, a container of tofu. Yes. I'm not going to lie. I can eat a lot more than that. Has, where is it? 9 grams of protein. What? And I just said babies, or at least my baby and kids love tofu. So that is easy peasy. Peanut butter. If there's no allergy, this is 2 tablespoons. It has 8 grams of protein. It's a lot of protein, especially when I'm talking about amounts like 15 grams, 35 grams. You can see eating will get you there. And this is just a can of beans, 7 grams for half a cup, which we already mentioned. But it's so, if you're eating plants, and I didn't pull up any fresh produce here, but if I had some, like I said, a cup of steamed broccoli, and a cup of broccoli is not a lot of broccoli because it's pretty flat. Has 4 grams, so it's not for nothing. Like all these foods are going to have protein in them. By the end of the day, good luck under consuming protein. Can you do it if you were eating Twizzlers and Oreos all day? Yeah, you could get enough calories. Yeah, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about your calories from a mostly whole food diet. And there's room for processed food. Hello, it's still going to have protein in it because it's processed from plants, which are just, full of protein. So yes, you're going to get enough protein.
Susan, you came prepared.
I knew you were going to ask.
Thank you. I mean, when you said inevitable, you just really just showed us. You really just showed us. It is, you're absolutely right. It's inevitable. thank you for those numbers, because I think sometimes it's also important to just have those numbers in our heads and to be able to have, real life examples like you showed us right now is, again, really reassuring.
Yeah. Especially for all those moms out there that are like, my kid only eats white pasta.
Right.
I mean, it's not to say, yes, if you can get a bean in there, great.
Right, sure.
But at least, it's not the worst thing.
Yes, absolutely. No, that was actually really powerful. Thank you for sharing that, Susan.
Of course.
We've had, and thank you for actually going through all of those macronutrients. We talked about carbs, we talked about fats, we talked about proteins. And, I think, as you mentioned, just to reiterate for everyone listening, that, the easiest approach in making sure or thinking about, having a well-planned plant-based diet for your children is to focus on the whole foods and the plants. Just as simple as that. And as you so beautifully showed us that example, that even without thinking about it, even without considering it, you're inevitably going to get all of your nutrients at the levels that are needed. As long as I think the job that parents have to do is making sure that those things are in your home and that you're preparing them and that you're offering those things to your children, and not those other highly processed and other things. So if you are taking on the role of transitioning your family, having those things in your house and readily available for your children, they will get all of their nutrient needs met. Absolutely.
And I think I heard from you, Dr. Sardana, and I'm sure it will come up in this series, that you don't throw a bunch of oranges at your kid or carrots with stems.
Right.
You clean them, you peel them, you lay them out, and they are gone.
Yes. Gone.
You do the initial work. Yeah.
I promise. Yes. What Susan's talking about is one of the ways that I make sure that my kids get their rainbow. And I don't do this on a daily basis. I do this on a weekly basis. I'll do this a couple times a week and it's part of it. I mean, to be honest, is the fact that I'm a busy mom and I really may not have the time to just really think about, okay, I need to prepare, a whole meal. What I'll do is essentially create a platter of all the veggies that are sitting in the fridge, the fruits that are sitting out that maybe, are starting to get a little too ripe. I'll go grab hummus, I'll grab avocados, and I'll essentially create just a platter of all of that and leave it out for my kids. And we even make a little game out of it, right? So if I, need to be doing something else, and I'll set up that tray for them and we'll ask them, oh, did somebody eat a fruit that was yellow? Did you eat a vegetable that was orange? We turn it into this playful kind of game, I guess. But my children, even without that game, enjoy just kind of having, that visually pleasing platter in front of them. It just encourages them to eat. And I have peace of mind knowing that I've done my part and my kids are getting all the nutrients that they need. That's one, tip or trick, if you want to call it that, from a fellow plant-based mom to the next. It really does work. My kids love it. And it's delicious. So thank you, Susan, for that kind of breakdown of the macronutrients that we talked about. So the next kind of piece of that is talking about micronutrients. So what exactly are micronutrients? Do we need to be obsessed with them? Tell us a little bit about micronutrients.
Yeah. So when I think about micronutrients in children, I kind of start chronologically. As soon as your baby is born, someone is going to tell you that he or she needs vitamin D, a reliable source of vitamin D, because don't stick your baby in the sun, keep your baby covered, or don't even, some people don't even take your baby outside for a few weeks. Regardless of however you respond to that guidance, if you do choose to keep your baby out of the sun or completely covered in the sun, you're going to need a vitamin D supplement. So that's one. Yeah, that's true. And the American Academy of Pediatrics has had that on their docket since, I think, around 2000 to make that recommendation for all newborns. So that's something you need to think about. And as your child gets older and maybe you're more comfortable with the child being in the sun and getting that D naturally, which is where it comes from naturally, there's no real reliable dietary source of vitamin D. It's the sun. So whether, and that, any adult knows this too, who might have low vitamin D. It's like, if you're not getting in the sun, you might need a supplement too. So that's true for babies, day one. Chronologically, again, the next micronutrient that is on my checklist would be, okay, at 6 months, your baby on average has just run out of his or her iron stores that the baby took out of your placenta and held on to and was able to use sparingly, but at 6 months, it's kind of like, you're out. You ran out of iron. So that's why pediatricians recommend feeding at around 6 months. So I think traditionally it's always been like an iron fortified rice cereal, but really any kind of grain cereal that's fortified with iron, or any natural food that might have iron in it. And most, a lot of plant foods do have iron in them. It's just part of the soil. So and it depends on what the baby can tolerate too. Now, if you're nursing, there's going to be iron, pretty readily absorbable iron in the breast milk. That is not true from necessarily from formula. It's a little less absorbable. But at any rate, if you're not nursing, or when you start to introduce foods, having some of those sources be kind of an iron dense plant food. So depending again on what your baby can tolerate, that could be mushy beets, pureed beets. It could be pureed lentils or peas, mushy peas, to have kind of a pretty good iron source. Spinach that's cooked and pureed is a really rich iron source. I recommend for some parents who might be having trouble, like adding a little bit of blackstrap molasses into those purees, which is a really dense source of iron.
Yeah.
You smell it and it smells like an iron pole. So it's in there. But that's, those are kind of some of the tricks you can use. And especially if you're not comfortable using an iron fortified grain cereal or something like that.
Those are great tips. Thank you.
Yeah. Another thing that's just kind of come on my radar in recent years is just making sure there's a good source of iodine in the kids' diet, because it's just kind of gone by the wayside as we have sort of steered away from either adding salt to foods for health reasons, or using fancier salts that aren't iodized.
Iodized, yes.
Right. And then just simply, again, a cultural preference for not consuming seaweed. So, but iodized salt and seaweed are great sources of iodine. So if you can somehow figure out a way to get that into your kids' diet as well. So if you're salting a little bit of those pureed foods with iodized salt, you're fine. And if you choose to have seaweed as part of, if you can get that in your kids' palate early, good on you. Calcium, you're going to hear a lot, I think, about kids. This is when kids' bones are building. It makes vitamin D very important. That makes exercise very important. And that also makes a lot of micronutrients that we're not going to really go into, but like magnesium and potassium are really important for bone health. But calcium is the one you're going to hear about a lot. And calcium is in those leafy green vegetables. It's readily available, even more so in a green leafy vegetable than in a supplemented drink, whether it's cow's milk or almond milk or soy milk. It's twice as absorbable from those leafy greens. So if you can get your kid's palate to enjoy, and that's not just how it sounds, kale, yes, kale, but it's also broccoli, it's green cabbage, it's Brussels sprouts, collard greens. So whatever you can get your kids into, even if you have to disguise it in a smoothie, it's a great source. However, enriched plant milks are a fine source too, and they offer as much, if not more, calcium than cow's milk. So I think those are all, those are kind of the nutrients that jump on my radar for all kids. Like, are you making sure you're getting those?
That's phenomenal. I think, just having those, I also appreciate how you've kind of went through that chronologically. I think that's really helpful for parents as your child is growing. What are the things that you need to be thinking about as your child is growing? Well, how do those, nutrient needs differ or change as your child is developing? So that was phenomenal. Thank you. Yeah. Now, when we think about, micronutrients, in a plant-based diet, for children who are, vegan, on a vegan diet, on a vegan plant-based diet, the big micronutrients that we really have to maybe pay special attention to?
Yes. So anyone who avoids animal products completely, will need a B12 supplement.
Yes.
Again, another opportunity for me to plug breastfeeding. But if you're a breastfeeding mom and you take a supplement, the child will get the nursing child will get that B12 and that's great. So as long as that's happening, you don't really have to think about this. But once the child, and it's supplemented in formula as well. Once the child though is either done with nursing or done with formula and he or she is completely plant-based, yeah, you're going to need to figure out a supplement for the child. And that can be, even though the amount is very, very tiny, 2.4 micrograms per day, you're going to want to make sure either in some kind of, depending on the age, a drop, if you can't chew, or a chewable, or maybe it's in a kid's multi. It's inevitably going to be in that kid's multi. But I just want to give a quick just reassurance that B12 is not something that's made by plants or animals. It's made by bacteria. So you can, and our diet is very hygienic. We wash our plants. So we're not going to get it from the plants, hopefully. That's kind of a good move away. It's a pretty good deal. I'll take the clean supplement. And you're not, and we have it in our lower intestines, just like a cow does. So we can either get it kind of out of an animal's body, or we can just go for the supplement, which is how I would recommend you do it. And it's pretty easy. I give my son, who's 6 and I have for years, I give him like half of sublingual because it tastes good. And I only do it like 3 times a week or something. So it's pretty easy routine.
I agree. I think, one of the things that I appreciate as you're speaking and as we're having our conversation, what I realize is that when families start thinking about transitioning to a whole food plant-based diet, you start considering and thinking about things that you didn't think about when you were not eating whole food plant-based, and maybe that you should have been considering when you were not eating whole food plant-based. It's not that just because you're eating a whole food plant-based diet that all of a sudden you have to start thinking about all these nutrients. It should be done in any diet, but specifically I find that when you are eating a whole food plant-based diet, families are much more intentional. They're more considerate of the foods that they're putting into their bodies, into their children's bodies. And I think that is a, unrecognized or under-recognized kind of skill that you gain as being a plant-based parent. You start, understanding and realizing and paying attention to some of these things.
Absolutely. I think we get kind of it's almost looked down upon. It's like, why are you thinking so hard about what you're eating? Is it because you're vegan? It's like, well, in a way, it's just that this is actually important. And I'm glad to be in a place of thoughtfulness when it comes to something so important to all of us. And we do, and when we're parents, we think a little harder. I mean, I wish everybody put themselves up on a pedestal as much as we put our kids up on a pedestal, because we all deserve to be as healthy as possible. But I love that it brings a lot of parents to the vegan table because they're thinking, maybe for the first time, what is the healthiest diet? And I want to do right by my kids. Like, good. And do right by yourself too.
Absolutely. I think it's such a lovely kind of way to show love, to show your affection, to show your concern for your children, because you are really deeply, thinking about their health in all these ways. And they're going to feel that, they're going to know that, and they're going to take that with them, and hopefully, for a lifetime and for the next generations to come. So I think it's a beautiful habit. It's a beautiful kind of, change in lifestyle that, provides a return on your investment in so many different ways. I highly encourage everyone to, start making those steps if you haven't already, if you've been wavering a little bit, this is your notice that no, you're doing the right thing. So that's great. One more important part of transitioning, if a family did not, start out being vegan or whole food plant-based, and they're starting to transition, we're seeing all over kind of our grocery store shelves, all the transition foods, the faux meats and cheeses and things. Is there ever a role to use these types of foods in the diet of a plant-based family? what are your thoughts, Susan?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think for the word you said, which is transition, if you were transitioning your family over and it's like suddenly like no more hot dogs,
right?
That's like what? But if you said here's a healthier version of a hot dog, and frankly, like hot dogs, to me,
in general,
like what is that anyway? So it basically tastes the same. But yeah, that's a real easy switch, and I see its place. And I enjoy a tofu dog on the 4th of July. Like it's kind of a fun tradition we have. So I think it has a place transitionally. I think it has a place occasionally.
Yes.
And as long as they're not these there are some transition foods that I'm more hesitant to green light all the time. They're just very high in fat. And now there's so many burgers out there that they are perfect transition food. But boy, once you get off, because they are pretty unhealthy, but if they can get a meat eater into a plant-based program, fantastic.
Right.
But if you're thinking about making that your staple item, I would be, let's try to get more beans into the diet. But yeah, I think that there's definitely a place for them. And honestly, if I'm just full disclosure, I didn't bring any props, but they're in my refrigerator. I have tofu dogs in there right now. And I'm like, you know what? I don't mind the ingredients and I don't mind the nutrition profile of these things. So it's A-okay.
I think that's so important to hear, because oftentimes, again, there might be this misconception that all of a sudden you're just eating salads or smoothies, and who knows? There's all sorts of kind of, preconceived notions of what this process looks like. And again, I think an important, hopefully, what these conversations will help parents realize is that we're not talking about perfection. We're really talking about intentionally thinking about the health of your children and focusing on whole grains, fruits, vegetables, plant proteins. And there is room for, as you mentioned, occasional treat here or there. I think where we kind of fall off a little bit is when that transition food all of a sudden just replaces the meat burger that you happen to have like weekly, then it's no longer healthy. And when those treats, there's always a sugary sweet treat for every single birthday and every single occasion. It's no longer occasional. It's, it's the standard. And so understanding and being aware of bringing some awareness to that, I think, is what's really important through this process too. And there's space for it, but to not get lost in the fact that stay focused on, these 4 important groups. And once you're doing that, you're going to get all of your nutrients, you're going to get all of the healthy things that you need, that your children need to thrive, eating this way.